Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the EFSA webinar on funding opportunities for third parties. I would like to welcome all of you, the new attendees, new to EFSA and EFSA work, but also attendees that are already experienced with EFSA and EFSA work. My name is Alessandra Giarola, and I'm one of the first speakers for this webinar. I work as scientific officer in the Regulated Product Department. The agenda for today foresees a short introduction and the webinar outline, a first presentation on EFSA sourcing needs presented by myself and Tom Mavis, a second presentation on EFSA sourcing tools presented by Donna Lucas and Marco Cortopassi from Finance Unit. And then a closing live question and answer session that will be chaired by the four speakers. Starting, I would like to present a short webinar guide to briefly explain how the interface works. So the webinar is being recorded, it is in English, and the four questions should be submitted in English through the platform. You are already automatically connected to the audio broadcast in a listen-only mode. You can see how the presentation window looks like. The slides you can see the slides projected, and the webcam of the speaker is active, so you can see the speaker while he's presenting. In case you need, the Q&A box for any question related to topic or unexpected IT issue is available. Live Q&A session will follow the presentation on EFSA sourcing tools and will close the webinar. Written question can be submitted anytime using the Q&A chat function. You can say the icon displayed on the side. Some of the questions submitted in writing by the audience will be answered orally during the live Q&A. But don't worry, because the remaining unanswered questions will be published on the EFSA website along with the recording of the event. So now, let's start with the first presentation on EFSA sourcing needs. I will present the first half, and then my colleague Tom Mavis will take over. So I would like to start by introducing the regulatory framework in which EFSA is currently working. So the General Food Law, which is the foundation for food and feed law, has been recently amended by a new regulation, the regulation 2019-1381, they also called the Transparency Regulation, that became applicable on 27 March 2021. So the aim of the new regulation is quite broad, but the main goal is to increase the transparency of risk assessment process in the food chain, strengthen the reliability, objectivities and independence of the scientific studies submitted to EFSA, and reinforce the governance. So why is it important to mention the transparency regulation? Because the implementation of transparency regulation has generated, from one hand, an increased volume and complexity of tasks already performed by EFSA, and on the other hand, the need for new tasks that are currently not performed by EFSA, but that we would like to develop or implement. EFSA has identified new sourcing needs pertaining to scientific and technology areas to support directly or indirectly business as usual tasks. In the presentation today, we are giving high-level indication regarding the area of interest. So before digging into the individual sourcing needs, it could be useful to explain or to refresh for the attendees that are maybe already familiar with EFSA process, how EFSA scientific process work in case of new application and in case of receiving generic mandates. So in the top half of the screen, you will see the scientific risk assessment of application, which implies 5 steps. The first one, the pre-mandate activities, includes some new task that has been introduced as a result of the implementation of transparency regulation, such as the notification of studies, the pre-submission advice, and the public consultation. Step number 2 is dossier ingestion activities, so where the dossier is validated. Step 3 is the preliminary activities to risk assessment, with the workforce planning, working group definition, and need for scientific support to be considered. Fourth step is the actual risk assessment, so where the opinions are drafted and additional data are requested if needed. Then draft opinions are finalized by staff and working group and finally adopted by the panel. Last step, number 5, is the output publication and dissemination. So below you can see the process then for generic mandates, which is very similar to the scientific risk assessment of application, with the exception of step number 1, pre-mandate activity missing. So the new step 1 is directly mandate ingestion, with the negotiation of the terms of reference, the scientific value definition. Step 2, preliminary activities to risk assessment, involve the protocol development and again the workforce planning. The actual risk assessment, step number 3, has the protocol implementation and then the finalization by the working group and the adoption by the panel. The last step, number 4, which is the output publication and dissemination, stays the same. So when the sourcing needs will be presented in the next slides, you also find at the bottom of the slides the steps of the risk assessment process to which each area belongs to. And we hope that we can also helping you in orientating in the phases of the risk assessment. So starting from our past sourcing plan, but also combined with a recent analysis to uncover or discover new needs and new trends, we created 5 micro areas that are potential candidates for future expression of sourcing needs. My colleague Tom Mavis will present each of them, providing also with some examples. I would like to reiterate the disclaimer I gave in the introduction slide. These are areas of interest for EFSA. So in order then to materialize or evolve into actual sources initiatives, there is a planning and prioritization process in EFSA that is part of the EFSA annual work plan definition. So only initiatives included in this plan can then be executed. As third parties, you will be able to see those initiatives only launched as official calls. And my colleagues from Finance Unit will spend some words on this later in the presentation. So the 5 areas are all activities related to data, artificial intelligence, brains experts and scientific support, administration, coordination, and auditing. And now let's have a closer look at those micro areas, and I will hand it over to my colleague, Tom Mavis. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Also from my side, my name is Tom Mavis and I work as a Scientific Coordination Officer in EFSA. As my colleague Alessandro explained, I will briefly guide you through the several areas, macro areas that we have collected. As you can see in the first slide, we have divided these macro areas in three steps where we go a bit more in detail. So when in the process do they occur? This is with a reference to the graph that you saw 2 slides ago. Examples of what kind of tasks that they entail. And then some high-level expertise needed, which is not the exact description that could follow in a call, but just to give an idea of what kind of high-level expertise we are looking for these calls. The first one is administration and coordination. So the whole risk assessment workflow in EFSA is a very long process with a multitude of steps. EFSA over the past year developed electronic workflows and also electronic dossier builders to support this process. Although we have very limited workflows, the underlying legislation and all the requirements that come for each food sector area are very diverse. This all needs to be managed and checked. During the ingestion phase, there is an important work which leads to the acceptance or the validation of a dossier. This means that for each application, we go and check if all the requirements that are needed for a dossier to be complete are met. This also entails interaction with the applicant, where we might go and ask for missing information. But also during risk assessment, this can happen. As we dive deeper into the dossier, we might find out that we are missing information, or we might want a clarification from the applicant. Other possibilities is that sometimes we go into a public consultation where we put a dossier or a protocol that we develop to answer a risk assessment question out to the public in order to receive feedback on our approach or on the content of a dossier. Also, this interaction means that you need some administration and some management of all this interaction and the data coming back. So all these activities and their coordination represent quite a big workload. And as Alessandra explained, the transparency regulation has added a couple of steps on top of what we used to do 2 years ago. So this has even increased quite a lot. It's mainly administrative work, but a bit of a scientific background in the food feed sector area is more than welcome. And there's also, of course, some project management and coordination. With the transparency regulation, but also already before in some regulations that govern some areas of EFSA, there have been specified some quality requirements for studies. Such quality requirements are, for example, the well-known good laboratory practice, which describes how a study should be performed and what rules apply to the practices in a laboratory. But there's also others. There are ISO standards or OECD standards, all of this described in the guidances for each separate food sector area. During the dossier ingestion, several compliances with legal requirements are checked. And this is also what we will do with the auditing. EFSA has, over the past year, initiated this activity and is going more and more in depth and more developing this in order to make sure that the quality of the data is up to level and that we see as much as possible appliance to this standard wherever legally required. We developed a checklist and we also installed a group of experts, a working group that can help us with difficult cases in order to make sure that we do the correct assessment. This is important because if a study is GLP compliant, it can have a higher value in the risk assessment because its results would be more trustworthy. We are looking to expand these checks further, and since we really get thousands of studies coming in via dossiers, it is a huge amount of work, and we might be looking in the future for some support from outside in order to do this. What is needed for this? It's a background in auditing and some familiarity with the prescribed standards. These are like the minimums that we need. Scientific support. This is a very big area, as you will also see that the slide is quite crowded. Risk assessment is a very complex process and it needs very specialized scientific expertise from extremely diverse angles. This is not only because EFSA is covering many different areas. So if you look at the examples, we go from food to feed, we do food contact materials, we do pesticides, animal health and welfare, plant health, genetically modified organisms, etc. So a huge wide array of different scientific topics. The staff performs preparatory work, but the increased level of complexity and the volume of the data that we receive forces EFSA to look for some scientific support, potentially in several areas. The most acute ones are mentioned on this slide, and as you see, it's already quite a long list. We can engage in different ways, and our colleagues of finance will explain more which are the different tools, but this can go from engaging with an individual through framework contracts to tap in some knowledge area of an organization where we can then launch separate calls as we need this kind of support. Also important is that EFSA is trying to keep his experts, his staff, and everyone working with EFSA up to date with the latest scientific developments. This means that we often organize trainings for our experts and for our staff. Also here, we often rely on external partners to provide these trainings as we look for very specialized people in the area. and this is probably the biggest one, it's data. A risk assessment completely relies on qualitative and reliable data. We collect data in various different ways. One of them, for example, is via the member states, and we have even mandatory monitoring programs that provide us with yearly data on, for example, occurrence of zoonoses or BSE. But also we have data from applicant dossiers, data from literature, data from data calls that we put out to get specific data on a specific topic, etc. To make data usable, they need to be validated, cleaned, and also analyzed. At the moment, data is ever increasing, and there's new tools and technologies that make it possible to generate very refined but also massive amounts of data. Think, for example, of geoinformation systems or whole genome sequencing, which delivers a very detailed representation of a genome, but this also means a lot of data. So we are looking increasingly for support in that area, and that could be very diverse, going from a very simple request for an extraction or a summarizing of data to setting up a complete monitoring and collecting capacity involving eventually several partners. Which is a bit of a special one, but since we are having a lot of data and we have it under different forms, we have it under numbers, but we also have it under text. And an increasing number actually comes from text. It comes from literature, questions to EFSA, the public consultations that we put out, etc. To help processing with all this text-based information, we are looking towards the possibilities of artificial intelligence. Also, the more structured applications dossier, which are built using the electronic dossier builder, can help us there in using the potential of artificial intelligence. This is not a core business of EFSA, and hence we are seeking support in developing this capacity. We don't have a lot of liberty, let's say, because EFSA has a strict IT strategy and a technology roadmap, which means that whatever we develop in artificial intelligence has to fit within this strategy and this roadmap, and it has to be implementable in the existing IT architecture of EFSA. EFSA also already organized like small hackathons to develop, for example, applications for a certain area to, example, facilitate the collection of monitoring data or consumer data, occurrence data. So this is an area of growing interest, but it is, as you will say, a bit diverse, and it can go in all directions. It can also be applied to whatever, let's say, stage of the risk assessment, going from ingestion up to the point of publication, wherever there is data that we need to retrieve from text or from numbers. So in conclusion to all this, we can say that EFSA could be launching calls in very various areas of expertise using the financial tools at our disposal. We have always been doing this. This is not new, but mainly for scientific development projects. And we are increasingly looking now in the last years for support in our business as usual, the day-to-day, let's say, risk assessment activities. And this will even expand further in the future because we are dealing with an increased scientific complexity and also increased volumes of work. If we want to guarantee the quality, the independence and the trustworthiness of our risk assessment, protecting the EU citizens, we really have to make sure that we put in all the work that is needed. How can you tap into all that? That depends a bit on who you are and what we need. But stay tuned, because that is exactly what will be explained by our colleagues from finance. And we start off with Donna. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, my name is Donna Lucas, and I'm a finance procurement and grants officer in the finance unit here at EFSA. And with my colleague Marco Cortopassi, we are going to present to you the different EFSA outsourcing tools that are available for procurement and grants, which is the way that EFSA outsources some of the scientific activities that Tom and Alessandra have been talking to you about already. Now, EFSA every year offers a range of opportunities for scientific collaboration via its grants and procurement schemes. Now, as outlined by the previous speakers, the collaboration is sought on a very wide area of activities that contribute to EFSA's mission, in the area of data collection, preparatory work for scientific opinions, as well as other scientific and technical assistance activities. Now, the value of the scientific grants and procurement that will be awarded in 2021 is 23.5 million euros, and that's set to increase to 40 million euros in 2022 and will increase further in future years. Now, how does that translate in terms of the number of opportunities available? More than 80 calls for proposals, so grants, and calls for tenders, so in the procurement field, are launched on average every year. In EFSA this year, it was more than 80 in the procurement and grant scientific field. Now, the average value of those procedures is around 350,000 euros per call. However, the actual value of each call may vary significantly from 15,000 euros up to several million. So there are a range of opportunities in procurement and grants at varying values that organisations who work within the field of EFSA's remit may be interested in pursuing. Now, first of all, I talked to you about the opportunities in relation to procurement. The procurement opportunities that we have available have to follow the rules in the EU financial regulation for procurement. Now, those rules set out a number of different procurement procedure types which EFSA can use to put in place contracts for the supply of services by providers in the market. Now, the type of procurement procedure that we use will depend on whether certain conditions are met. Now, the most frequently used procurement procedures at EFSA are open calls or negotiated procedures. Open calls are usually for calls with a value of above 139,000 euros. And those calls are advertised in the EU official journal, and they are open to all operators with access to the EU market. The other type of procedure that EFSA uses a lot is for slightly lower value, so between 15,000 and 139,000 euros, we use negotiated procedures. Now, those are not subject to publication in the EU official journal. Instead, the opportunity to participate in these new negotiated procedures is advertised on the EFSA website. And if you express an interest in participating, then you will be directly invited once the specifications are ready, and you will be invited to submit an offer for that. Now, in some exceptional circumstances, we can also launch what we call monopoly negotiated procedures. These are very exceptional because by their nature, we're only inviting one organisation which has a monopoly on the provision of that service. They're less transparent because they're not advertised on the website and they're not subject to prior publication in advance of contract notices. However, there are very strict conditions in the financial regulation for the use of these procedures. So they are not widely used and they have to have very compliant situations in which those procedures can be adopted. Now, when we launch a procurement procedure, we will receive offers, hopefully, for that. We will evaluate those offers, and the evaluation committee will be responsible for awarding the contract resulting from that procurement procedure. Now, from every procurement procedure that we have, there will result a contract, and those can be one of two types: a direct contract or a framework contract. Now, a direct contract is for the provision of services on a fixed duration and for a fixed price, whereas a framework contract is usually setting up a contract with a maximum duration of 4 years. And under that framework contract, we will then place orders periodically when specific services are required. Next, if we have a look at grants. Now, grant procedures are advertised on the EFSA website regardless of their value. So unlike with procurement, we don't have the big difference between the different thresholds and the different means of publication depending on value. All EFSA procurement grant procedures are published on the EFSA website, and Marco will show you where to find that information later. Now, similarly to procurement, in duly justified circumstances, we also have monopoly grant procedures where we will have a direct invitation to potential grant applicants, inviting them to participate in a monopoly procedure. Again, strict conditions apply there for the use of that procedure. Usually we're inviting organisations that have a particular technical competence in that area. Similarly with procurement, we receive applications for grants, we will evaluate them, and the evaluation committee will propose the award of the grant agreement. And the grant agreements take two forms, either a direct agreement or a framework partnership agreement. The direct agreement, again, is for a fixed duration, for a fixed amount of contribution, which is determined in the estimated budget. Whereas the framework partnership agreement sets up a cooperation for a maximum 4-year period, in which, once signed, we will then place specific agreements each time we want some services to be performed. Now, usually with grants, there's always the principle of co-financing and also no profit. So EFSA would pay a share of the costs and the beneficiary would pay a share of the costs. Now, in the 2018 financial regulation revision, they introduced a new form of grant, which was called financing not linked to cost. And that form of grant actually focuses on the output and the deliverables, which need to be very clearly defined at the outset in the call for proposals. Now, this form of grant, this form of funding, actually foresees that those who are awarded these grants can make a profit, and also they do not impose the principle of co-financing. So it could be that the beneficiary who receives the grant is not required to contribute financially to that project. So the amount of the grant that would be paid at the end is linked actually to the deliverable which is provided. It's not actually linked to the cost of producing that deliverable. The amount that would be paid is generally an amount to incentivize an action, and we would tend to use those types of grants where there's not really a reliable proxy for the actual cost of the action. Now, EFSA has been experimenting quite a lot with this form of grant in the last 12 to 18 months. And we see some advantages with this form of financing in grants, certainly on EFSA's side, but we've also seen benefit on the beneficiary's side, is that less evidence needs to be provided. In the past, grants could be quite heavy administratively in terms of the evidence that needs to be provided to evidence the costs incurred, such as payslips, invoices, timesheets. When we have a financing not linked to cost grant, what we're actually interested is in the deliverable at the end, rather than the actual cost that went into producing that deliverable. Now, I look here at the difference between procurement and grants, because sometimes that's a difficult concept for people to understand what is the difference between them. And I think the borders are a little bit blurred, in fact, when we look at the concept of the financing not linked to cost. But if we look at the purpose behind a grant, the purpose behind procurement rather, is that we are buying something. We're paying an amount to buy goods and services. And if we take the next step in that, which is the ownership, we actually own what we buy. So in procurement, the ownership of the deliverables would rest with EFSA. Now, conversely, when we look at grants, the more traditional grants, the purpose was not necessarily to buy goods or services, it's to give a financial contribution towards something. And taking that into consideration, EFSA would not necessarily own the deliverable from the grant. The ownership usually would rest with the beneficiary. Now, the financing not linked to costs form of grant funding is something that's blurred those lines a little bit, but these are the general principles that I present here. Now, in relation to payment, if we're talking about procurement, usually it's an agreed price which allows for profit, whereas in grants, we were always paying in the past a share of the costs and the principle of no profit was applied. Now, the rules in the EU financial regulation do foresee a number of principles that we have to respect in our treatment of procurement and grants, and they are broadly similar if we look at transparency, equal treatment, and non-discrimination. However, in grants, we also have these other principles in relation to non-retroactivity, so we can't contribute to an action that started in the past. The principle of co-financing, so we should generally expect that the beneficiary would finance part of the action. Non-cumulative, which also means that an organisation receiving a grant should not be in receipt of a grant from another EU body. And we also have the no profit principle, which we discussed on the previous slide. In procurement, we also respect somewhat the principle of proportionality, so we should make sure that all our actions are proportionate in relation to the size of the service that we're outsourcing. And we see that in relation, for example, to the number of checks and the requirement of transparency based on the value of the procedure. So lower value procedures require less transparency, less advertising than the higher value procedures, which of course are advertised more widely. In terms of what we call these procedures, in a procurement, it's a call for tenders. In grants, a call for proposals. The legal forms are similar. We have direct and frameworks, contracts in procurement, but agreements in grants, because that's really to reflect the collaborative approach that we would have in grants. We're not buying a service in grants, so that's why we have the difference in terminology there. Now, a very important difference between procurement and grants is who is able to participate. So in procurement, anybody with access to the EU market is able to apply to our procurement calls. And I know my colleague Marco will explain a little bit more about that in forthcoming slides. In grants, we have a limited pool of potential applicants, and I come on to explain that in a little bit more detail on my final slide. Now, as we mentioned before, not everybody can apply for EFSA grants. EFSA grants can only be awarded to organisations which are on something called the Article 36 list. Now, the Article 36 stems from our founding regulation 178 of 2002. And in Article 36, it foresees that there will be a limited pool of organisations that we could entrust tasks to on behalf of EFSA. So EFSA can advertise our grant opportunities, but we can only award them to competent organisations that are designated by the member states and are put on the list of Article 36 organisations, which is approved by the EFSA Management Board. Now, the list currently includes approximately 300 organisations. The list is updated regularly, so as member states designate organisations within their country and ask for them to be accepted on the Article 36 list, the list is updated. Now, there are a variety of organisations active in the fields of EFSA's mission, and these would include universities, research institutes, governmental organisations or other public bodies. Now, there are some strict eligibility criteria for inclusion on the list, and these are set out in Regulation 2230 of 2004. But fundamentally, they should carry out scientific and technical support tasks in the field of EFSA's mission. They should pursue a public interest objective, and they should be organisations that have a high level of scientific expertise and technical expertise within EFSA's remit. Now, after this presentation, after this webinar, you will be able to go to these slides, and embedded in the slides, we've left a link to the full list of Article 36 organisations, so that you can go and see which organisations in your country are on the Article 36 list. Maybe you're not on the list yourself, and for example, it would not be the case that commercial organisations would be on the Article 36 list, but it might be interesting for commercial organisations to see which organisations in their country are actually included on that list and can apply for grants. We also have a link to some FAQs which go through in detail how an application would be made for inclusion on the Article 36 list. And a critical part of this is the role of the EFSA focal points. So they are the interface between EFSA and the competent organisations at member state level, and they really are one of the first ports of call if organisations want to find out more about how they could be included on the list and the process in their country for approaching the member state national authority for that inclusion. Now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague Marco, who will continue with the next part of the presentation to look in more detail at the EFSA outsourcing tools.
Thank you very much, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marco Cortopassi, and I work in finance unit as a procurement and grant officer together with Donna. Let's look at how EFSA goes about deciding whether to launch a procurement or a grant procedure. What are the factors that EFSA takes into consideration when deciding to launch a procedure to source scientific services needed? Well, there are a number of questions, a number of considerations that are taken into account during an internal discussion. You can see here a number of those questions. For instance, one question would be is there a need to limit the task execution to the group of Article 36 organizations that we have seen. This is we know that under the grant rules, we can somehow decide to limit the use of subcontracting, so we can ensure that the work is exclusively and solely done by Article 36 organizations. This is not possible usually within a procurement environment where subcontracting can only be limited in very critical case. So this consideration would be made. Another question is if the task itself that we need support on is within the ones that are eligible for grant support, because not everything can be outsourced by EFSA. There are activities that are listed in what we see in the Commission Regulation 2230 of 2004, and in Article 4 there is a list of the areas where EFSA can outsource. So we've seen already with the presentation of Tom before, data collection and analysis, production of scientific data, harmonization, preparation of work for scientific opinion, etc. So if the task that we need to outsource is not on that list, then grant will not be an option and we will use the procurement channel. Another question that we ask ourselves is if the expertise that we need is within the Article 36 list of the competent organizations, because if it's not, then we belaeve that it will not be within those organizations, then most probably the call will fail, and then we will have to relaunch as a procurement procedure. And finally, another consideration that we always make is whether it's acceptable for EFSA that the ownership of the project outcome remains with the beneficiary. We've seen in the previous slides that under grant rules, the ownership of the results are the property of the beneficiary of the applicant, let's say, and this, of course, does not prevent EFSA to reserve rights for licensing and for use, but still it's a very different situation compared to procurement, where EFSA solely acquired the ownership of the result of the project. So who can apply to our procurement and grants? So let's start from procurement. So procurement procedure for EFSA are open to all economic operators with access to EU market. And by this, we mean that they must be based in a EU member states or in a country that has signed with the EU a bilateral agreement on access to public procurement procedures. And there is a list of these countries, and it's available in our documentation. I will show you later on where these can be found. So when applying the rule of access to market, when we talk about organizations, then we are going to look in where the organization is established, in which country, in which territory it is established. And when, on the other hand, we considering the individuals, the natural person, then the country is identified as the country in which the person has their domicile. Now, tenders may apply under procurement rules alone or in a joint offer with other partners. And in this case, all partners will sign the contract with EFSA, and they will all must have access to EU market. But tenders may also decide to involve subcontractors. So EFSA does not sign the contract with subcontractors. There is no direct contractual relationship. Subcontractors work for the tenderer together with the tenders, and unlike the partners, they can, let's say, belong to countries that do not have access to EU market. So subcontractor can be from outside these EU. They don't follow the rule of the access to markets, unless in some code there are specific requirements where EFSA needs to restrict also for subcontractors. And this is sometimes the case at the moment for services involvement, treatment of personal data. Let's now look at the grants. So for grants, we've seen, we've done that before, only organizations that are on the Article 36 list can apply for grants. And so these organizations are based on mainly in the 27 EU member states, plus Norway and Iceland, excuse me, that have a special bilateral agreements. Application from single organizations are accepted, but also in consortium. And actually sometimes in the call requirements, EFSA demands that the call is put, sorry, the application is done in a consortium, so it can be obligatory. And the subcontracting is also permitted, it's possible in grant, but it cannot be for core tasks. And this is usually defined in the call text. And subcontractors, they do not need to be on the Article 36 list. So this is a possibility for organizations that are not in the Article 36 list still to collaborate with EFSA in grants, as long as they don't deliver the core tasks. They must be delivered by the Article 36 organizations. So where to find the information? Let's start from procurement. We have a very detailed guidance. It's called EFSA Guidance for Tenders. We will see in a minute where this can be found on our website. But there is where you will find the exact list of the countries that can apply, and also full details about the procedure type, how to apply, and the rules that are applicable to each procurement. In general, we've seen the call for tenders. We have the two main groups of calls, what we call open calls and negotiated procedure. And this you can find on our website In addition, you can find what we call the PIN. It's a PIN stands for prior information notice. Is a way for EFSA to display the future upcoming course before they are launched. And this is a way, let's say, to provide an outlook to potentially interested applicants before the codes are actually launched. We will see in a minute where this can be found on the website. Then we have a section on the open calls. These are the calls above directive threshold with value above 139,000 euros. And then we have a section on the negotiated procedure. This is where we must publish in advance our intention to launch one of these procedures, where the value stands between 15,000 euro and 139,000 euros. And this is where interested applicants can make an expression of interest. So all the open calls are published in addition in the EU official journal, and in particular on a portal that is called e-tendering, where the applications are also submitted for tenders. And it's important that to know that you can register within this platform and you can receive automatic updates about the calls in tenders in your fields of interest. And this not only for the EFSA calls, but also for other European contracting authorities, let's say. EFSA also uses LinkedIn and promotes the launch of calls through the platform using the hashtag EFSA Procurement. And we also have our RSS feed where you can subscribe to keep up to date with the procurement, new calls. Now I would like to show you very briefly our website, and in particular the procurement, the procurement part of our website. So this is our landing page, and under the Engage tab, there you can see the three categories that just mentioned: the upcoming tenders, where you find the pre-information notices, then the tenders above threshold, the open call, and the tenders between 15,000 and 139,000, the negotiated procedure. So if we go into the under Engage in the open call, we can see together how these calls are displayed. This is the list of the open calls that are actually open at the moment for EFSA. They come as a description of reference and title, and on the right-hand side, you have the date of publication and the deadline for application. And on the left-hand side, you can click on that, and by clicking, you will be accessing and being redirected to the TED, the tendering platform of the Commission, where you will find the full set of procurement documents, as well as the right instructions and the channel for you to apply for the procedure. Now, if you go back to the slides, we can look into the grants, where to find the information about the grants. So all EFSA grants are published on the EFSA website in another section. We will see that in a minute. And the guide for application is published alongside each call for proposal. In addition to that, as soon as EFSA publishes a call for proposal, we also inform directly via email the focal points, so that they can proactively disseminate within the network of Article 36 organizations in their country the opportunity. Like for procurement, we also use the hashtag EFSA Procurement on LinkedIn. And we also have a document that we call Scientific Cooperation Plan. This is a document that is published periodically on our website, and includes information on the subject matter of the future calls, in particular the grants, but not only the grants, also scientific procurement, They provide an indication of their estimated amount and the estimated launch date. Again, this is to give you more time to interested organizations so they get prepared for applying. I would like to show you now very quickly the grant page on our website. This is the landing page, and in here you will arrive in here again via the Engage tab. In here you will find in the list all the grant call, the ones that are open and are currently tagged with the green tab. And if you click on each of these, you will be landing on a dedicated page where you can find the call for proposal text, the documents, the annex, and all full explanation and requirements to apply for the call. And in this page, I just take the opportunity to show you further up the document that I just mentioned. It's in here, and it's an Excel file, and it's called a Scientific Cooperation Plan. So if you click on that and you download it, you can see what EFSA is planning to publish in the upcoming months. And this is a document that it's updated regularly on our website. Thank you, Don. You can go back then again to a slide. We can look into how to apply. So let's start from procurement. Application for procurement will depend on the procedure, and this is explained in detail in the EFSA guidance for tenders that we just mentioned. But in general, for open calls, tenders must apply using the e-submission online tool that we have seen on the e-tendering portal. For negotiated procedure, on the contrary, candidates are specifically invited to apply, and also the information and the application is exchanged by email. Now, for the time scales, these vary very much from procedure to procedure. However, there are minimum time scales set in law, and in particular for the open call, the minimum number of days from publication of the call until the deadline for submission is 42 days. The evaluation under procurement is carried out by EFSA staff, and all the tenders, regardless whether they are successful or not, they will receive a detailed feedback about their application. The evaluation process is always done via a number of mandatory steps. There will be criteria that will be screened and assessed. Exclusion, the first criteria, for instance, the bidding from a country that has no access to the market would be a reason for exclusion. Then the selection criteria, which looks into the experience and the professional capacity of the organization. And then the quality, and this is intended as the quality of the technical offer itself. And finally, the price. So this is about procurement. When we look into grant, we have a different way of applying at the moment. Application for grants in response to our calls are done in original hard copy, by post or by courier. And EFSA aims, however, to align to the procurement methodology, let's say, and we are looking into having in place an e-submission tool also for grants in the near future. Like for procurement, also timescales to apply varies from one procedure to another. It depends very much on the complexity of the call, and also if there is a requirement or not to make a consortium, in which case the duration for preparation of the consortium will be accounted for in the time for the application. And similarly to procurement, again, the evaluation is done by EFSA staff, and detailed feedback is provided. And in terms of the evaluation criteria, we have the same criteria, except that the price that it's not part of the grant logic, let's say, but still exclusion, selection, and quality will be the mandatory steps of the evaluation of any grants application. And I will conclude with this the presentation of this scheme, which is something that we have available in EFSA in addition to grant and procurement. In fact, EFSA offers also opportunities for collaboration specifically targeted to individuals. So the scheme is called the Scientific Technical Support and aims at creating a list of individuals, so the natural persons, with the scientific expertise that can work in assisting EFSA in preparatory work, in risk assessment, and in assessment of applications for the authorization of regulated products. So these experts would be contracted under the 237 Article 237 of the Financial Regulation, and they will receive a fixed remuneration per day. The scheme is implemented by a call for expression of interest that it's published, and then it's continuously open for a duration of 4 years. And under this call, candidates can register, and their application would be assessed periodically on a need, let's say, on a need basis. And the selected candidates then will be called to provide their expertise in their personal capacity. So they could be PhD students, they can work for a research organization or university or another type of organization. They can be retired or self-employed, and they will apply on their own personal capacity. Again, here we have rules for in terms of, let's say, access to scheme, and when it comes to the country where the application comes from, and individuals can apply mainly from, let's say, EU member state, EFTA countries, and the EU candidate countries. However, experts from third countries may also apply, and they will be considered if the required level of expertise was not found among the national of the, let's say, EU, EFTA or EU candidate countries. But they're not, let's say, automatically excluded, as it would be the case for procurement. At the moment, we have 2 lists open. We have one specific to novel food and nutrition sources, and then we have a larger one embracing most areas of EFSA operation, really. And I think both lists will be active until 2024. So we're launched in 2020, will be open until 2024. Application in this case is submitted via the EFSA career page. So this is not going through the grant or procurement channel. It's going through the section in the EFSA website where EFSA recruits staff, and there is also a specific section on, let's say, recruitment of scientific technical support. So with this slide, I conclude this part of the presentation on the outsourcing tool, and I like to thank you for your attention, and I give the floor back, I think, to Alessandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you, Donna, for the presentation on the EFSA outsourcing tools. We can open now the live Q&A session. We have received a few questions that we would like to orally answer now. In case there will be additional questions that will remain unanswered, don't worry, because we can then publish the replies on the EFSA website along with the records of the event. So the first question, which I will probably reply to, is about whether the slides is going to be available. The answer is yes. So the recording of the webinar will be made available in the next days. So you can listen again the webinar and follow the slides as well. For the second question, I will ask Tom to answer. It is about if it is possible for a postdoc researcher to collaborate in EFSA without being located in Italy.
Yeah, thanks, Alessandra. Is it possible as a staff member? No, but as a collaboration via procurement, yes. And one of the mechanisms that is quite easy is the one that Marco indicated in one of his slides, which is about the scientific expert scheme, which has a continuously open call on the website. This is an ideal method to collaborate with us. You just fill in your application, and then whenever we need someone with your profile for a dedicated task, we can call you and ask you if you are interested to do this for us. So this is, like, let's say, the most easy and the most free way to engage with us as an individual.
Thank you, Tom. As I've seen that we haven't received any additional question yet, I would like then to, first of all, thank you, Donna, Marco, and Tom for the contribution. But in case you have been overwhelmed by all the information that we share with you today, and if you want to actually ask additional questions, then feel free to resubmit them or submit them through via Ask EFSA. You can see the link in the slides. As I said, the recording of today's webinar will be available in the EFSA website in the next few days. But also, please take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation form that you will receive shortly in your inbox. And with this, I would like to thank all the attendees to our webinar today. I hope you found it useful. And I would like also to leave with different ways of getting back to us or connect with EFSA. You see, there are many different ways, so feel free to contact us in case you will have a new question to ask, or if you would like to hear more from us as well. So thank you very much, and bye-bye.